The night had already settled over the city, wrapping the streets and buildings in a quiet that felt heavier than usual. Inside one glass tower, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above polished floors that reflected rows of empty desks and cold, lifeless chairs. The office was a place designed for bustle and business, but now it was silent, the hum of computers and ringing phones replaced by an eerie stillness. Mark was the night shift security guard for this building, a man used to solitude, to walking these corridors when everyone else had long gone home. He arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, unlocking the main doors and stepping into a world that, by day, buzzed with life, but by night, felt abandoned and strange. The only sounds were the soft, steady ticking of the surveillance monitors in the security room, tiny digital clocks counting seconds that seemed to stretch endlessly in the empty space. Mark sat down, his chair creaking softly beneath him, and booted up the security system. Rows of camera feeds flickered onto the screens, each showing a different part of the building. Deserted hallways, locked doors, empty conference rooms, a maze of silence. As he adjusted the settings and ran his fingers across the keyboard, Mark reminded himself that this was just another quiet night. No alarms, no emergencies. Just watching, just waiting. The weight of the stillness pressed down in the air, heavier with every passing minute. He poured a cup of coffee, the steam rising slowly in the cold air. His eyes scanned the monitors, looking for anything out of place, anything unusual. But all he saw were empty rooms and flickering lights, nothing to worry about. Or so he thought. The building had been standing for decades, and many who worked here believed that after dark, something changed. But Mark never paid much attention to stories like that. He was here to do a job, alone but alert. Tonight, however, would test exactly how alone he really was. As Mark's eyes moved steadily over the grid of camera feeds, his focus sharpened. Each screen was a window into a different part of the building, a different piece of this quiet, vacant puzzle. Most showed nothing but empty halls and lifeless rooms, but then, on one screen, a flicker caught his attention. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of a long corridor. It was there for a brief moment, barely visible, as if someone had slipped out of sight before the camera could fully catch them. Mark leaned forward, squinting. "Must be a glitch," he muttered, tapping the screen and refreshing the feed. But the shadow didn't reappear. Still, an unsettling feeling crept over him. The air in the security room seemed to thicken. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep inside the building, he heard it, soft footsteps. They echoed down the hallway, just beyond the camera's view. Slow, deliberate, and steady. Not the quick scurry of a rat or the creak of a settling building, but footsteps, slow and heavy. Mark's heart rate quickened. He sat still, straining to listen, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they began. He glanced at the hallway camera again. The lights overhead flickered, once, twice, then stuttered irregularly, plunging the corridor into brief darkness before the glow returned. The flickering lights cast strange shadows that seemed to dance and stretch down the empty hall, twisting in ways that made his skin crawl. At that moment, his radio crackled to life. Not a call or a word, but a low static whisper, almost like a voice speaking just beyond understanding. Mark reached for it, adjusting the volume, but the sound only grew louder, layering over the hiss of interference. He switched channels, hoping to find a clear signal. The whispers persisted, drifting in and out like a forgotten language. A cold chill ran down his spine. He glanced around the room, suddenly aware of the darkness in the corners, the way shadows pooled beneath the desks and behind cabinets. It was as if something was watching, waiting. Something just out of sight, barely holding back from stepping into the light. Mark swallowed hard. The office was supposed to be empty. He was supposed to be alone. But right then, alone felt very different. Without warning, every screen on Mark's security monitors went black, like a power cut rippling through the system. The sudden absence of light sent an icy shock through him. The quiet hum of electronics vanished. Then, on the one screen that flickered back to life, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the center of the lobby, stood a blurred figure, tall, motionless, watching. The figure was indistinct, like a shadow woven into smoke, but it was unmistakably human-shaped. Mark's eyes darted between the screen and the actual lobby behind him. Slowly, he turned in his chair, heart pounding against his ribs. But the room was empty. No one. Nothing. He told himself it was a trick of the monitors, a glitch, a reflection, anything but real. But then the figure appeared again on another camera, standing just inside a doorway, still motionless, like it was waiting for something. Mark's pulse quickened. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He frantically cycled through every camera feed. The figure was everywhere, sometimes just on the edge of view, sometimes standing in the middle of an empty hallway. And then slowly, one by one, the images flickered out, the figure vanishing from each camera as though it was melting away. Mark's breathing grew shallow. The cold crept deeper, freezing his blood. For the first time in his years on night shifts, he felt utterly alone and utterly watched. He bolted from his chair, his eyes scanning every corner of the lobby and corridors, desperate to find something, anything, to explain what he'd just seen. But the silence swallowed his footsteps. There was no one there. Mark handed in his resignation the very next morning. He couldn't shake the image of that blurred figure, the feeling that something had been there with him, unseen but unmistakably present. Months later, over coffee, a coworker pulled him aside. "You know," the coworker whispered, "there's footage from those night shifts." Security caught something strange. The footage showed a man, unknown to anyone, quietly roaming the empty building at night. The chilling part? The man looked just like the figure Mark had seen, pale, silent, and still. What made it worse was the story behind the man. Years ago, an employee had died in that very building, his body found in the lobby after a late shift. No cause was ever clear. No one had seen him on camera until that night, until Mark's shift. Mark never returned to that job. And sometimes late at night, when the world is silent, he wonders if that figure is still watching, waiting for someone else to stay alone too long. Lisa had grown used to the nights spent alone in the warehouse. The sprawling, cavernous space filled with rows upon rows of towering shelves stacked high with crates and boxes. By day, the warehouse was a hive of activity. Forklifts weaving through aisles, voices calling out across the floor, and the steady roar of machines moving freight. But at night, everything changed. The hum of the machines was still there, a low mechanical drone that filled the space and seemed to stretch into the distance, endless and unbroken. Yet the absence of people made every sound sharper, every creak and clang more pronounced. Lisa's job was to conduct the inventory, a task she had performed countless times before. It was routine, repetitive, and dull. She moved slowly down each aisle, scanning barcodes, marking lists, and checking boxes. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a cold, clinical glow, but even their brightness couldn't erase the shadows tucked beneath the shelves or the way the rows seemed to stretch on forever. As she worked, she tried to focus on the task, to keep her mind busy and avoid thinking about how alone she really was in that massive building. The silence pressed down around her, thick and heavy, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe or the distant clang of metal striking metal somewhere deep in the warehouse. But there was something about the night shift that felt different, something unseen resting just beyond the edges of her vision. The stillness wasn't just empty, it felt alive, as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting. Lisa had heard the stories. Rumors passed between workers about strange noises, whispered voices, and unexplained movements after hours. She'd never believed them, chalking them up to tired minds playing tricks. But as she scanned the next crate and glanced up at the darkened aisles ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight might be different. As Lisa moved through the endless aisles, her eyes scanning the labels and tallying the inventory, a strange sensation began to creep over her, the feeling that she wasn't as alone as she thought. At first, it was nothing more than a faint murmur, like the distant rustle of voices just beyond the edge of hearing. She paused, straining her ears in the heavy silence, but the sounds faded away. Then again, the whispers returned, soft, indistinct, almost like words spoken in another language or voices trapped behind a thin veil. Lisa's heart quickened, and she spun around, her eyes searching the shadowy space behind her. But there was nothing there, only the long, shifting shadows cast by the flickering overhead lights. The fluorescent bulbs overhead struggled against time, flickering erratically, sending sharp, broken beams cutting through the darkness. The shadows seemed to dance, twisting, stretching just beyond reach, as if the very air in the warehouse was alive with movement. A sudden chill swept through the aisle. Lisa's breath suddenly became visible in the cold air, a small mist hanging, fragile and fleeting. The temperature had dropped without warning, the warmth she'd felt moments ago replaced by a biting cold that gnawed at her skin. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, glancing uneasily down the dark aisles stretching out ahead. Then came the subtle movements. A crate shifted slightly, the sound soft but unmistakable against the quiet. Lisa froze, staring at the box as it creaked and nudged, as if pushed by an unseen hand. A few steps away, a loose cardboard box toppled over, spilling its contents across the concrete floor. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she looked over her shoulder once more. The warehouse, vast and silent, held its breath. Something was here with her. Not visible, but close enough to touch, watching, waiting. Lisa's fingers tightened around her scanner, her eyes wide as the whispers began again, soft, urgent, just beyond understanding. Lisa's breath caught when, amid the soft whispers and shifting shadows, she suddenly heard it. Her name, spoken clearly and deliberately just behind her. The sound was low, almost a hiss, but unmistakable. Lisa. She whipped around, heart hammering in her chest, eyes searching the dim aisles for any sign of movement, any hint of a presence. But the space remained stubbornly empty, cold and still except for the faint hum of the overhead lights struggling to stay lit. Then, without warning, the lights died completely. The buzzing overhead bulbs flickered once, twice, and then vanished, plunging her into a darkness so complete it felt like the air itself had thickened. The warehouse, so vast and cavernous, folded into a suffocating blackness where not even the faintest shape could be seen. Lisa stood frozen, her pulse roaring in her ears, every sense straining for something, anything, in the darkness. And then she felt it, a breath, cold and ragged, brushing the back of her neck, a chilling whisper of air that made her skin prickle with terror. A faint, feather-light touch grazed her arm, soft and cold, like fingers barely brushing through fabric, but enough to send a shock straight through her body. The sense of being watched, of something so near it could reach out and touch her, became overwhelming. Without thinking, Lisa spun around and ran, the sound of her footsteps pounding against the concrete echoing through the empty aisles. She didn't look back, driven only by the desperate need to escape whatever was there. Just as she burst through the warehouse doors, the backup generator roared to life, flooding the space with harsh white light. But when she glanced back inside, the aisles stood empty once again, silent and untouched, as if nothing had happened. The darkness had swallowed whatever was there, but Lisa knew it was still waiting, somewhere deep inside the warehouse. The following day, as sunlight streamed through the warehouse windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the cold floor, Lisa tried to shake the heaviness that clung to her. The night's events weighed on her, the memory of whispered voices and that chilling breath refusing to fade. Later, during a brief break, she found herself in conversation with a longtime employee. He spoke quietly, his voice low as if the warehouse itself might overhear. He told her something she hadn't known, that the building had been constructed on top of an old burial ground. The land beneath the concrete held stories long forgotten, graves disturbed and histories buried beneath steel and stone. Lisa's stomach tightened. It explained the cold, the shadows, and the whispered voices. She wasn't the first to feel it. Workers from years past had told tales of strange sounds, moving objects, and cold spots that no one could explain. Many refused to work alone after dark, and some had even quit rather than return for a night shift. But what unsettled Lisa even more was what she discovered later when reviewing the security logs. The system showed that, during the hours she had been alone, someone or something had logged into her workstation. The timestamps matched every moment she had been there, but Lisa was certain she hadn't moved from her spot. She had been alone. No other employee had access during those hours. The log showed no signs of hacking or error. It was as if an unseen presence had taken control, watched over her work, even mimicked her actions in the dark. Lisa never returned to that warehouse overnight. The quiet whispers, the sudden cold, and the touch in the dark were enough to keep her away forever. Some places carry memories that refuse to rest. And some nights, being alone is the most dangerous thing of all. James had long grown accustomed to the quiet that comes with the late-night shift at the small radio station, nestled miles away from the nearest town. Surrounded by dense woods, the building stood alone, a lone beacon of light and sound cutting through the darkness. By day, the station buzzed with activity, voices of hosts, jingles, and callers filling the airwaves. But as the sun slipped below the horizon, James found himself alone in the dimly lit studio, the only human presence for miles. The silence outside was thick, heavy with the rustling of leaves and distant, unknown sounds carried on the wind. The walls of the studio were lined with old equipment, dials, knobs, and meters that flickered gently under the glow of red and green lights. James settled into his chair, leaning into the microphone with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. His voice was calm, a low murmur meant to soothe the night listeners, crackling softly through the speakers. Tonight's show was just beginning, and James ran through his usual introductions and music selections, chatting quietly between songs, filling the empty space with his voice. The steady pulse of sound was a comfort, something to break the solitude that wrapped around the station like a thick fog. But even in this familiar routine, the edges of the night held a different feeling. The woods pressed close outside the windows, shadows seeming to shift and flicker just beyond the glass. The isolation settled deeper into his bones, a quiet reminder that out here, alone, the night had its own secrets. James wasn't just broadcasting to an empty studio, he was speaking into the vast darkness beyond. As the night deepened, James settled into his rhythm, spinning tracks and chatting softly into the microphone. The usual calls from night owls and truck drivers came through, voices crackling with static, stories and requests cutting through the silence. But soon, the familiar patterns began to shift. The first strange call came unexpectedly. Heavy breathing on the other end, no words, just the sound of someone gasping for air. James paused, unsure whether to cut the caller off or keep the line open. The breathing faded, then a soft whisper, unintelligible but urgent. More calls followed, some filled with faint cries, others with static-laced voices that seemed to warn him to leave. Each one was more unsettling than the last, sending a prickling chill down James's spine. He glanced toward the studio's lone window, the darkness beyond seeming deeper, darker than before. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the edges of the building, carrying whispers that seemed almost like voices lost in the breeze. Inside the studio, the power flickered, causing the equipment lights to sputter and the speakers to buzz with sudden bursts of static. James tried to keep his composure, brushing off the noises as interference, the calls as pranksters playing games with a lonely DJ. But as the night wore on, the station seemed to close in around him. Then came the tapping. At first, faint and distant, like the soft knock of fingers on glass. It grew louder, more insistent, coming from the studio window just beyond his reach. James turned to look, heart pounding. But outside, the woods remained still and empty, shadows deep and unbroken. A cold sweat formed on his brow as the line crackled again. This time a voice, distorted, distant but clear. "You're not alone." James's grip tightened on the microphone. Something was here with him. Something waiting. The studio door suddenly slammed shut behind James with a deafening bang that echoed through the small room. His heart leapt into his throat as the lights flickered wildly, casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. The hum of the equipment stuttered, then died, plunging the room into near silence except for the crackle of static on the radio. James spun toward the door, fumbling for the handle. It was locked tight, no amount of twisting or pulling would budge it. Panic bubbled in his chest as he realized he was trapped inside. The speakers burst to life with a burst of static before a whispering chorus of voices filled the air, repeating his name over and over, soft, desperate, and impossible to locate. The cold in the room intensified, frosting the edges of the equipment and chilling his skin. From the corner of his eye, James saw shadows crawling along the walls, stretching and twisting into shapes that defied explanation. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out, only a strangled gasp caught in his throat. Then a tapping began on the studio window, slow, deliberate, and growing louder. He turned to see nothing but the blackness of the surrounding woods, dense and unyielding. The phone rang suddenly, the shrill tone slicing through the darkness. James hesitated, then answered with trembling hands. A distorted voice hissed through the line. "You're not alone." The lights flickered once more, and then went out completely, plunging the studio into pitch black. James stood frozen, every nerve on edge, as the whispers surrounded him. Voices from nowhere, voices from everywhere. In that darkness, he knew whatever was with him was watching, waiting. When the morning crew arrived at the station, the quiet was broken not by the usual hum of the late-night broadcast, but by an eerie stillness that hung in the air. The front door, which should have been locked tight after James's shift, stood wide open, swinging gently on its hinges as if pushed by an unseen hand. Inside the studio, they found James slumped unconscious in his chair, his face pale and eyes closed as if he'd been caught in some terrible nightmare. No one could explain how the door had been unlocked or why James had not called for help during the night. As the station manager reviewed the phone logs from the previous hours, a chilling pattern emerged. Dozens of calls had come through from a single number, one that traced back to a location just a few miles from the station, an abandoned asylum, long closed and left to rot. The asylum was a place steeped in dark history, whispered stories of former patients who never truly left, of cries heard in the dead of night, and of shadows moving through empty halls. For years, locals had told tales of strange lights flickering in the broken windows and voices carried on the wind. What made the calls all the more disturbing was their timing. They came steadily throughout James's shift, a constant, haunting presence over the airwaves. It was as if someone or something had been trying to reach out to him, to warn him, or to trap him in that isolated room. James never returned to work the late shift again. The experience left him changed, haunted by memories he rarely spoke of. Some nights, when the wind blows just right, you can still hear a faint voice on the radio. A warning, a whisper, a reminder that in the dark, you are never truly alone. These stories reveal just how strange and unpredictable it can be to find yourself alone at work. When the silence isn't just silence, but something else entirely. When the ordinary turns into something you can't explain, and the shadows around you seem to move with a life of their own. So tell me, what would you do if you were left alone in a place like this? Would you stay and face whatever waits in the dark, or would you run the moment the lights flicker? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. I want to hear from you. And if you want to uncover more true horror stories that will keep you looking over your shoulder, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling tale. Because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that really happen.